And so Audrey, all of our folks here are relatively new to the Climate Smart Communities program. Some of them have been working in environmental issues for years, and some have some experience working with their local government through other projects, but all fairly new to Climate Smart Communities. And they're all working towards their bronze certification. And maybe let's also just go around and say, maybe give like a quick update as to, are there any solar projects in your town, any issues? And that will definitely maybe be feeding Audrey's brain while she's speaking, and then we'll get into it in the Q&A as well. So go ahead, Dan, start with you, because I know you got some juicy stuff.
Yeah, so I'm as you probably know, I'm a yes and a yes. We have a 60 megawatt project, 100 acres, very controversial. And I'm the co-founder of Friends of Columbia Solar, which is a support group for the project. And in fact, this really good timing because we actually have a informational open house that Hecate, the developer, is doing tomorrow afternoon and evening. So that'll be interesting. See if we're starting to get to some kind of turning point.
Yeah, they're switching over to the Section 94C process, as I understand it. So I'll probably listen into their 1 o'clock call tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. I will see you there.
Yeah, familiar. Okay.
All right. Oh, and welcome, Kristen. Kristen, can you tell us where you're located, and also tell us what the state of solar is in your town? Are there any projects that have happened that are coming up? What's the scuttlebutt?
Well, I'm from the town of Hurley, which is in Ulster County near Kingston. And there is investigations going on about potentially siting a solar farm on our capped landfill. And there's also some people looking into the town opting into, there's a CCA in the area, consortium, or possibly doing it ourselves. So there's that. And then Ulster County just announced a Solarize campaign for Ulster County. And also there, a CCA, and there's some questioning about, well, if you sign up for one, does that mean you're not in the other, and vice versa? And it sounds like there's some things that need to be worked out between, Solarize campaigns, community solar, and CCAs, and how does that work? Could be very confusing for people.
Great question. Great question. Thanks. Did I get everybody? Christina? What's going on in Germantown?
Nothing so far. We don't have any solar, commercial solar currently, and we actually have 2 people who work in the solar industry in various ways on our planning board. So they're kind of doing a workshop right now with the town board about, I think kind of what we're going to talk about today. The first one that I went to talked about the Scenic Hudson tracker tool, and just kind of figuring out where sites that may look attractive are, and figuring out ways to smartly zone things. So it feels like we are very lucky to have some people kind of know some stuff, and it's made me be able to be like, great, go on.
And how about Chow? What's going on in Northeast Millerton?
So we have a solar law that was passed last year, and we just passed for the town the unified solar permit, and now we have to go back and retrofit our law to talk nicely with it. I'm not sure how that works. The village does not have a solar law yet, and no permit at this point. The village has a small array that powers the water tower, and it was installed 10 years ago. The only site that we have that would be appropriate in the town is probably our old landfill, which is just about 30 acres. It's barely big enough. And there are some lines that come not too far from it. That's been investigated a little bit, but no takers so far.
Mhm.
Oh, and a huge chunk of our land is in Dutchess Land Conservancy under easement. So I'm very interested to understand how the easements and what's the current thinking about, protecting views.
Wonderful. All right, so we already have some juicy stuff here for Audrey. So I'm really happy to welcome Audrey to our session today for Local Champions to talk about these issues, and in particular siting and working with the community. Audrey Friedrichsen is the land use and environmental advocacy attorney at Scenic Hudson. And Scenic Hudson is a non-for-profit, actually based in Poughkeepsie, but dedicated to preserving the scenic, ecological, recreational, historic, and agricultural treasures of the whole Hudson Valley region. Scenic Hudson strongly supports the goals of the 2019 CLCPA. The targets for renewable energy, as we know, are quite aggressive, which is good. But it means we got to figure out where to put a whole lot of solar. So Audrey's work really focuses on renewable energy siting issues and balancing all of the factors as we transition to more clean energy. So we're just thrilled to have you here today, Audrey. I know you're going to do a presentation, and then hoping we can have some robust discussion. So take it away.
Great. All right, I'm going to attempt to share screen of a PowerPoint. Unfortunately, when you do PowerPoints, it sort of messes up the nice gallery view and you can't see everybody at the same time. But if anyone, it seems like we have a pretty small group, and I'm happy to take questions, as we move along. So just shout at me or wave at me, even though I can't see everybody. So thanks for having me today. This is very exciting. It's nice to speak to a very small and specific group of people. We've been, since we have released our solar mapping tool that Christina mentioned, it's great that it's already getting looked at and used and cited as a potential tool. We have done numerous presentations, so this is going to be a yet another iteration, but this is one that's near and dear to my heart because I will focus on the planning and zoning, and specifically with regard to the issue that Paige and Vanessa raised for me, which is dealing or helping to encourage, right, and also take advantage of the places and spots for community engagement when there is an issue here that can be potentially pretty divisive. And it sounds like everyone here is on the side of, okay, let's get solar energy built here in the Hudson Valley, and how best to do that while engaging the community and trying to find ways to educate, bring people along, lower the level of anxiety maybe, and then find ways to make sure that we get planning and zoning on the books here that will both make sure projects get put in the right place and are designed and cited correctly. And then what that should do is hopefully lessen conflicts and, create the glide path to get these done. So that's sort of the point of view that I will do this from. Let's see if I can move us along. So as Vanessa mentioned, Scenic Hudson. We are a not-for-profit. We've been around for 50 plus years. This is a picture, as you all probably recognize, of Storm King Mountain. And the irony is that Scenic Hudson got its start when a group of people got together to oppose a renewable energy project. They had, Con Ed proposed to chop off the top of Storm King Mountain and build a pump storage hydro facility, which would suck water out of the Hudson River, pump it up when energy was at low usage, and then release it during peak usage, to make money and provide energy. And a group of folks got together and said, no, this is going to be too much of a visual and environmental impact on the river and our view shed here in the Hudson Valley. And ultimately the project was scrapped. And so for the most part, in our history, we have done a lot of opposing of projects. And so now we find ourselves in an interesting position where we are trying to find ways to support development and specifically renewable energy development in the interest of climate change mitigation. So I think we're all sort of on the same page there. And just very quickly from my background, I have been at Scenic Hudson for a little over 7 years now. Before that, I was an associate at a firm called Vanderwater and Vanderwater. So I did a lot of planning and zoning. So I was a municipal attorney for 7 years. We represented Poughkeepsie, Pleasant Valley. I was the planning and zoning board of attorney in Fishkill. We represented Millbrook, Washington, Kent, Marlboro, a lot of municipalities in the valley. So my background is in municipal law, and it does color the work that I do at Scenic Hudson in the interest of getting renewable energy sited, because my belief is, it is at the municipal level, at the local law, local planning board, local climate smart communities task force, local, environmental council, where the shovel goes in the ground and the impacts happen, and where some of the most critical decisions happen. And that's why it's very important for you all to have information at your hands to support the decision making. So that's my sort of perspective on how I come to these things. So just very quickly, the way Scenic Hudson operates, we have a strategic planning process. The most recent time we did it was in 2017, really recognizing, the critical juncture that we're at with regard to climate change. And one of the stools of our three-legged stool of our strategic plan is we really are interested in finding ways to strengthen the resiliency of the Hudson Valley. And we do that both through land conservation. We are a land trust. I did mention a land trust, mentioned the Duchess Land Conservancy. That's one that we work with a lot. So we're trying to identify lands that are very important to resiliency for conservation purposes. We help communities with planning, climate mitigation policies. So we're really trying to provide, again, information for folks at this intersection of our work. And our vision for the Valley is we're trying to help the Valley be a model of a regional response to climate change. And we recognize that renewable energy has a specific role in that. So that was our strategic plan, and since that time, we have been really moving forward, and this is why we have entered into the area of renewable energy development, tried to educate ourselves about what's going on. Everything disappeared here at the state level. So I don't know why this all disappeared, but just very quickly, and this is probably something that you are familiar with, this should say four things actually. It should talk about the original Clean Energy Standard from 2015, the new energy standard that is in the 2019 CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the law that was passed last year, the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, and then a fourth bullet point on sort of the mechanism of how all these things work. So I apologize, I'm not sure what happened when I shared my screen that those bullet points disappeared. So just, the state policy context that we're working in here is we used to have a 50 by 30 renewable energy standard, right? And what that means is that the load serving entities, our utilities, Con Ed and Central Hudson, have a legal obligation put on them to increase the amount of renewable energy supply that they use over time, right? Getting to 50% of renewable energy in our total electricity supply by 2030. In 2019, that was raised to 70% by 2030 and 100%, including some offsets by 2040. And that was actually codified in law at the state level under the CLCPA. And that CLCPA not only had a 70 by 30 renewable energy goal, it also had several targets for particular kinds of renewable energy development. One of them was offshore wind, one of them was storage, and one was solar in the form of distributed solar. And so, as it's very easy to get lost in like the acronyms and all of the different descriptions of what is going on here. And developers might show up in your town and start talking about things like community solar and distributed solar and large scale solar and utility scale solar and megawatts and megawatt hours and all of these different terms. But the basic difference between distributed energy sources and utility scale energy sources is sort of where they are on the energy grid. And what is happening is there is a transition in our energy supply happening. It used to be large fossil fuel based energy generation, right? Like Danskammer and Roseton and Indian Point, and long distance transmission of electricity over high voltage power lines. Then it gets stepped down and at a substation and then distributed along those poles along the street, and then you can turn on your dishwasher or toaster or whatever. But now what's happening is, as we put new kinds of energy supply into the system and smaller sources like rooftop solar or a community solar project, which is about 5 megawatts in size. And what happens is now the grid has to work both ways as energy gets inserted in at the distribution level, as opposed to always in large amounts at the high voltage transmission level. And so that goal in the CLCPA is both to achieve an overall 70% renewable energy goal, but also there's 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar that they want to have built as well. And so to that end, last year, the legislature adopted the Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which had 4 parts. One was a grid study to help us be able to make that transition. One is to support a build ready program to build on previously disturbed sites. And a third is the new Office of Renewable Energy Siting that was established with a whole new process for large projects. And fourth was a community benefit program, which at this point is in the form of a bill credit when a very large project comes into your town. And just one of the most sort of eye-opening things that I learned about as I was teaching myself about this whole thing is the mechanism by which this happens, right? So it's all very nice that we have this state goal that says we want 70% renewable energy and we want to build 6,000 megawatts of distributed and this much storage and this much offshore wind, but how does this actually happen, right? And so NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, in concert with the New York State Siting Board on Electric Generation and the Environment, which used to be the permitting agency, and now ORES, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, have this mechanism that's set up. And NYSERDA does 2 things. One, they issue solicitations for large-scale renewable projects. And one just came out last week on Thursday. And what NYSERDA says is, dear world, dear developer world, we want to contract with you for this many megawatts of large scale projects. And then the developers put in proposals, NYSERDA selects them based on certain criteria, and then they get a contract to sell what's called renewable energy credits. And so NYSERDA buys the renewable energy from the developers and then turns around and sells it to those load serving entities. Remember Con Ed and Central Hudson, so that they can demonstrate compliance with 70 by 30 over time, right? And then there's also something called the New York Sun program, and that's for smaller projects, community solar, or projects on commercial and institutional buildings, right? Like if Walmart puts solar on their project, on their roof. And then somebody also mentioned a Solarize project, and that is for the most part probably directed to smaller residential rooftop solar projects, right? So those are some of the mechanisms that these projects are incentivized to be built. And that's creating a market, right? The whole idea here is to make renewable energy, and here in the Hudson Valley, solar energy is the kind of energy that we have available to us. We don't have that much wind resource, right? So they're trying to create a viable market for this kind of energy supply to compete with fossil fuels and ultimately displace it, right? And then hopefully we have a self-sustaining market. And that creates these different levels of projects. That's one of the great difficulties of solar, is it's so scalable. It can be everything from a couple of panels on your roof to some of these very, very large projects that we hear about upstate, or even the one that is proposed in Copake at 60 megawatts. So I'm sorry, that's a lot of me talking at a blank screen, That's what it should have said. I can PDF this and I'll, you know, provide it to Vanessa and Paige, and you guys can have it after. Oh, look, there it is. If I had just gone one page ahead, I don't know how I did that. So this is what I just covered, right? Clean energy standard shifted to the CLCPA. Last year, we've got the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, and then we have this mechanism run by NYSERDA to solicit these projects and really create a market. So it really does your community well to understand both this state policy context and this mechanism by which this market is being created, because that's sort of the first step in knowing what might be coming down the pike and trying to prepare for it, right? And head things off at the pass, do some planning and zoning and be ready. So, you know, turning back to Scenic Hudson and our mission, in the context of these state goals, we both want to make sure that we have a swift and just transition to renewable energy, but of course we don't want to do it in a way that, you know, impacts all of the things that we have worked so hard to preserve, including our ecological and agricultural and other resources. And so one of the big points to recognize is that meeting those goals can't be done only with rooftop solar or small solar, right? In order to be able to generate the sheer amount of energy that New York State needs, we will need to have some very large scale or utility scale solar projects and wind and offshore wind and storage. All of these things need to happen. So that leads us to the question of, you know, how best to fit these into our landscape. And, you know, where can these things go? Where can we expect them? And what makes sense? So that is the place where we found ourselves in when we started to think about what kind of tools we could make for Hudson Valley communities, or, you know, or folks such as yourselves, you know, the Climate Smart Community Task Force members or others as we go forward. And it's unfortunate that the Climate Smart Community certification, I don't believe has, you know, adoption of the solar zoning law as one of the action items that you can take for, you know, certification credit anymore. I think it used to be in there, but it no longer is. So, but despite that fact, you know, we do encourage communities to think ahead and be proactive, and think about solar zoning. I heard that you have a law in Millerton. I guess the village you said did not, but now you're trying to figure out how to integrate that with unified solar permit and all that stuff. So hopefully we have some resources that can be helpful to you. And also NYSERDA does as well. So what we did is we built this How to Solar Now toolkit. It has 3 main parts. One is a siting guide with principles for, you know, siting renewable energy, which is our original kind of resource. And then we also recently released a set of recommendations for zoning. And then we also have this GIS-based solar mapping tool. So again, all of this is in the interest of, you know, educating folks, you know, going through a process which includes opportunities for community input and engagement. And so I'll just talk about these resources quickly with a focus on places where maybe you can get that community input, you know, and sort of bring people along in terms of the discussion. So this is what the cover pages of the 2 documents look like. On the left, the Clean Energy Green Community Siting Guide is older. The zoning guide on the right-hand side is available only electronically right now on our website. Hopefully, when we get past COVID times, we'll also do some print versions of this, because it's always nice to have things in hand, although it is in a printable form. So, you know, again, as I mentioned at the outset, the idea behind trying to help guide projects to well-sited locations and having them be well-designed has a few purposes, right? This idea of smart from the start. Siting is to avoid conflicts from the outset, right? To help bring people along, and also which which should help streamline the review and approval process, which, you know, is a benefit to the developer. So it's supposed to, what we're trying to create here is win-win situations. I find so many times people talk about this issue and they talk about the idea of balancing, right, the harms. And there's that old trope about, you know that you've got a good contract and there's been a good negotiation and everybody goes home and nobody's totally happy. And that's not really the, the point of view I am hoping people to have when they come to How to Solar Now and use the tools that we have. What we're really trying to create is win-win situations as opposed to everybody loses a little bit in practice. So a couple of our, at this point, they're kind of obvious, I think, principles for solar siting, right? Number one, prioritize redevelopment and co-location. A lot of you mentioned landfill development, right? That makes a lot of sense. We have an area that's, been used for one purpose. Now it's closed. It may or may not have some level of contamination. We can't really use it for anything else. So why don't we put solar energy on it? Makes a lot of sense, right? Now, the difficulty is because of that contamination and the nature of the ground, you can't just drive posts into the ground and put up the solar panels as easily. So it becomes a more expensive and highly engineered process to be able to put solar on a landfill. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it raises the cost, right? So while on the one hand, in terms of redeveloping or co-locating with something else that makes sense, it does raise the cost of a project. Like a parking lot canopy solar, because of the engineering involved, is going to be a more expensive endeavor too, right? So those are sort of the considerations that you have to take into account in order to get the benefit of prioritizing the redevelopment kind of approach. And then on the other hand, right, avoiding impacts to our visual, natural, and agricultural resources. This is what where our solar mapping tool comes in. We provide GIS data layers to provide information and guidance to help do that. And then again, the idea here is to reduce conflicts, streamline the permitting, try and find ways to bring everybody along, right? We want renewable energy development to be successful. And then ultimately, right, we want to achieve renewable energy goals. And this is where maybe some difficulty comes in. And I recognize this. One of the things that I see in this process is a parallel to you mentioned up in the Northeast area, Millerton area, I think, did you say you might have, oh no, you said Dutchess Land Conservancy, but I think I draw a parallel to the New York City watershed issue, right? Where communities upstate were subject to flooding, right? Their homes were moved, their cemeteries were flooded in order to create reservoirs to tie in so that New York City will have fresh drinking water. And this is sort of the new version of that, I think, right? Because it's New York City that is the most, it's the biggest load and the biggest, user of energy in the state. If you look at New York State as a whole, more energy is produced upstate, but not that much is used upstate, right? And there's less room to create things like solar energy downstate closer to New York City, but that's where all the load is. So it creates this sort of tale of two grids, the way they refer to it here in New York. And it can create a lot of animosity because communities upstate get subject to development that they feel creates burdens, but doesn't really give any benefit. So that's what we're trying to do here, is educate people as to the benefit of these projects. And simply saying, oh, this is good for the environment and good for the climate, and the state has these renewable energy targets, and that doesn't really make people happy, and feel very altruistic and say, oh, okay, that's all right, then you can put these solar panels in my backyard, right? So that's really what we're dealing with here. So trying to find other ways to talk about this and demonstrate the benefits and convince people that this can be done smart from the start is part of the conversation that I think you can have with people. All right, where did my little arrow go? And then our solar zoning guide, and the same idea, there's this sort of set of recommendations in there, right? And I will pick out you know, if a community has solar zoning in place already or is interested in updating their solar zoning, NYSERDA has a guidebook for local governments. They do have a newer version of a model solar law, and they are adding resources to that every day. They are working on one for agriculture. They just added one on comprehensive planning. Like I said, the model solar zoning law has been updated. There's information on there about storage now. So there's a lot of, and also the tax law, right? Tax exemption. So there's a lot of information that NYSERDA has, and we created this guide as sort of a, you know, an additional resource, because Scenic Hudson, being a not-for-profit organization, we can take a position, right? But NYSERDA has to be a little bit more neutral and say things like, well, here's what you could do, or this is what you might think about, but we can make actual recommendations, right? So this is our series of like smart and pithy recommendations here for solar zoning. And number one, we are recommending that communities be pro-solar, right? Adopt a resolution, put it into your comprehensive plan, actually adopt a policy to say, we support renewable energy growth here in our community, right? And the guide has some recommendations about how to do that. Number two, not only be pro-solar, but also make sure you're eliminating the barriers. So Chow mentioned that you need to make sure that your zoning code doesn't conflict with the new uniform solar permit. And so that's what you need to do. You need to take a look at what's on the books and make sure that there aren't existing barriers to solar energy. So for instance, many zoning laws say anything not specifically permitted is prohibited, right? And so that creates a barrier to solar. And so you want to make sure that, you know, things that are pre-existing aren't blocking in any way. And very important, number three, make sure you're defining what we're talking about very clearly, right? This is where it becomes important to know the market, to know what these projects look like, know what their sizes are. And so the guide provides some proposed definitions of a solar energy system, right? And know the market, know what's coming down the pike. And then in terms of planning smart, this is where hopefully our GIS mapping tool, which I'll talk about in a second, comes in, right? How do you plan to fit solar into your community? That question, okay, we've found all the rooftops, we know where the landfill is, we might have this brownfield site or this closed quarry, those all make sense, right? Where are some of the other places where this might go? What can we expect? And then also, where are the places where it can interconnect? We worked very hard to get the hosting capacity information, which is where projects can tie in to the distribution lines into the tool. And when I say regulate right, number 6 here, don't overburden the approval process, right? So a smaller solar project is going to have less impacts than a larger ground mount solar project. So make sure that the regulations and the permitting process are appropriate, right? So that's why the unified solar permit comes in. It's a very short, brief, well-defined process that the developers know. This is this very standard thing. You can just go to the building inspector, get your CO, give them your electrical engineering, and end of story. Very, because it's a small project, rooftop, not very many impacts. But if it comes to a larger scale ground mount community solar or even bigger project, now we might need site plan and special use permit approval and go to the planning board and do seeker and hold public hearings, right? So make sure that you know what's coming, you plan for it, and then you build into your process the appropriate level of review that's based upon the kinds of impacts that you can expect. And then we talk a little bit about some of the divisive issues of visual impacts and agricultural impacts, and we give some information on how to deal with that. And again, solar energy seems to somehow be creating these issues when it's not new that projects are proposed and they have visual and agricultural impacts. I mean, people have been selling agricultural lands and developing subdivisions for years, right? And no one would say, well, you can't put a subdivision on ag lands. Why are we saying you can't put solar on ag lands? Why are we treating it differently? And trying to help people recognize that we have plenty of land use tools at our disposal already from many years of practice that we can apply here in this situation as well. And also, you know, allow it broadly, try and fit this into as many of your zoning districts as you can. Don't over-regulate it in terms of, you know, setbacks and height requirements and all of that. Provide some flexibility because, you know, solar developers need that flexibility in order to maximize the amount of energy that these projects generate, right? This is an engineering project. Here in the Northeast, we don't have that much sunlight. We have a good amount, but we don't have as much as we would in like Arizona, right? So the developers are very constrained by, you know, the direction in which the panels might have to go, how many they can fit in there, you know, the way they point, how, you know, in order to maximize the amount of energy that a project will generate over the year, right? Because they ultimately it's a financial situation, right? It is a money-making enterprise, and so they need to be able to maximize how much energy gets generated, and so that's a matter of the engineering and the layout and everything. And so being overly restrictive in terms of heights and setbacks will, you know, render a site just as undevelopable as if you say no solar there. Because it will increase the cost to a level that it can't be built anymore. And then a couple of other things, planning for the future. Decommissioning can be a pretty divisive issue. People ask, well, what's going to happen if this goes bankrupt and then we're left with this project here? And so there are a couple of different approaches. I think that the verdict is still out on whether a town actually does have the legal authority to require something like, you know, a bond. But I will leave that up to your municipal attorneys to decide. And then also you can build things into your code, like requiring subdivisions to be laid out in a way so that new houses or requiring new development to have some solar ready features built in there. So that, again, this is a lot of me just talking and you all staring at a slide, but these resources are on our website. You know, hopefully as you move forward in your, you know, potentially considering either new solar zoning or maybe some revisions, taking a look at what you do have on the books to make sure that it fits the situation that your town or community has well. So to that end, our sort of jewel in our crown of what we've created is a solar mapping tool, and it's a GIS based, so that's global information systems. And basically what it does is it takes data about what is on the ground and then represents it on a map. So that's what happened. It's sort of a clicky thing. Okay, so I'll put them all up. So we have a few different sort of places where we're hoping this tool gets used. One, as I was just sort of going on and on about, is supporting comprehensive planning and zoning for solar. But you can also drill down to a site and see what's there in terms of wetlands and forests and host, you know, distribution lines. But also, this is a big one. And this is, I think, maybe where it might be most useful to something like a Climate Smart Communities Task Force, is if you're doing something like climate action planning and you say, we're going to make a recommendation to our town board or somebody else to say, we have a goal here in our community to get 15 megawatts of solar energy built. Where can it possibly go? And so then, you know, the question is, you know, where are the places on the map that we can find to where it could go? And then how do we develop the policies and the local laws and get them in place to help incentivize and get that done? So these are sort of the use cases of the mapping tool. Just very quickly, we didn't do this in a black box and just make it in-house at Scenic Hudson and then release it to the world. We did invite input from municipal officials. We brought in folks from the agricultural community. We talked to conservation folks. We had DEC, we had New York State Ag and Markets, we had land trusts. We talked to developers about this tool, and then We also got input from the electrical utilities here in the Hudson Valley, and that's, Con Ed and Central Hudson and Orange and Rockland and National Grid and NYSEG. And we did also pilot test it. We worked with Chatham and Lloyd, one on either side of the river, folks from there to sort of be our guinea pigs and let us know about what should be in the tool and also its sort of user friendliness. And it has 4 parts. It tells you about solar. It tells you about our approach to solar planning. It tells you about all of the different data layers, and then it sets you free. And in part 4, you can turn all the data layers on and off yourself. But it does give a couple of examples to give you an idea of how to approach that. And our approach to solar planning has, it asks 4 questions. Number 1, what do we have on the ground already in terms of land use, right? How is our town developed? Is it rural? Is it agricultural? Does it have a lot of forests? Are we an urban community, right? Are you like the city of Kingston, or are you more like the town of Washington, right? Or Millerton? Number 2, where's the low-hanging fruit? Where are the opportunities to put solar? Where are the parking lots, the buildings, the brownfield sites, the landfills, the closed quarries? And we put all of the data layers to answer those questions into the tool. Number 3, where are the resources that we want to avoid? Things like valued agricultural soils, very important core forests, significant historical resources. Again, all of these are data points that get put onto a map, and you can turn them on and off and see where they overlap. And then number 4, ask the question about the feasibility of a place for solar. And that's a combination of, can you connect it into the grid? And also, what does the land form look like, right? If land is too steep and pointed in the wrong direction, you can't put solar there, right? Because you need to make sure that the panels can be arranged in such a way, again, to maximize and take advantage of solar energy in order to then create the product they're trying to sell, which is electricity. We do point out that you need to bring local knowledge to the table, right? What is your solar zoning, or what does your zoning already say? Do you have agricultural protection plans, right? Something like maybe an endangered species up in Greene County, grassland habitat is very important. We're dealing with that issue there. Your comprehensive plan, right? Maybe a natural resource inventory has already done. So it's not that there's, our tool exists in a vacuum, but the local municipality has a lot of information that needs to be brought to the table. And then, as I mentioned in part 3, you learned about the layers. So here you can see this is a representation of what's called the National Land Cover Data Set. And these colors, and you can sort of zoom in and out at a certain level, and you can see a little bit of the legend here. These colors tell you in broad strokes what's already on the ground. And that answers question 1. What do we already have in terms of development on the ground? And then we built in some data sets that can help you find sort of those, again, those low-hanging fruit, right? And there are repowering opportunities in terms of, is there a rooftop here? Is there a brownfield site that might already exist that you can, sort of write down on a list of places to help incentivize solar, right? And so now what you can do is write into your zoning law, ways to encourage rooftop solar by making it a very direct and streamlined process, right? This is just a zoom in of a rooftop. What we did is the tool outlines building footprints above 20,000 square feet, right? That's half an acre to help you find large rooftops to put solar on. And then we have, again, the important resources you can see here: agricultural soils, wetlands and water resources, wildlife habitat, mature forested areas, and then some historic areas. These are all mapped, right? And you can turn these layers on and off as you will to answer the question of what's there on the ground. Now, of course, that needs to be ground truthed, but this will get you started. And then the other thing the tool does is provide you with information, right? So why do we care about forests? and why are they relevant to solar development, right? I think somebody mentioned we don't want to cut down very, very important forest that has a carbon sequestration benefit for the sake of creating renewable energy, right? So we want to know where those important forests are. And this is the tool gives you information to help support decision-making in that regard. We also, as I mentioned, include something called hosting capacity. The utilities are required by the state to provide information about the distribution lines and how much room is in there for distributed solar energy projects to connect in. Now, this all is sort of shifting because, as I mentioned, at the state level under the renewable siting law, they're doing a grid study. And so they are really trying to find ways to integrate, right, the 70% goal with the grid to make sure that the interconnection system that we have is in a place where it can handle making this energy transition. But this is a very important piece of information that probably, while it becomes part of your planning consideration at the town level, it's actually probably the first thing developers care about, right? Because if there isn't a place to interconnect, then they have to pay money to upgrade the system to connect it. And that all factors into the finances of a project and whether or not it becomes economically feasible. And then part 4, this is a very busy thing, but this is where you get to turn on all the layers. Down on the bottom here is where you can choose from those layer groups. And the tool, it looks a little complicated, but it is actually pretty user-friendly in terms of being able to turn things on and off. And like I mentioned, we do have a few examples to help folks get thinking about how to use the tool and apply it in their community. And as I mentioned, we want the Hudson Valley to be an example, right? A model. And so we also provide people, this is probably less relevant for you all, but we do have a replication guide because we're hoping that the Hudson Valley, because our tool only covers our 10 counties here, isn't the only place where this exists. And other regions in the state build projects, a tool as well. So this is, I'm sorry that I managed to usually go on and on almost an hour about this stuff, but hopefully what this did is, start to give you some information on the tools that we have out there. And think about the process for planning and zoning. And then what you can do is think about where in that process are opportunities for you all to either, sort of engage the community and educate them in terms of bringing them along and getting folks more comfortable with the idea of fitting renewable energy into a community, right? And those places are, if we are going to adopt a pro-solar kind of stance, that can be done at the town board level. There can be time for public input, or if during comprehensive planning, getting input on what you think the goals of a comprehensive plan should be in terms of renewable energy. And then of course there'll be, public hearings on zoning laws itself. And then also, of course, in, if and when projects do come to the town, and if they do appear before the planning board or they need to go to the town board for some reason, again, there's sort of these opportunities for public comment. And then, of course, I think maybe, Dan, this is most relevant for you, but then there are, the issue of the very large projects. And as I mentioned, NYSERDA did just put out a solicitation for large projects again. And the very interesting thing is they've been doing this for the last several years now. And Hecate, which is the developer of the project that's proposed for Copake, they have 2 other projects in the Hudson Valley, one in Greene County and one in Albany County, or Albany, yes. And it's, those projects were proposed and awarded contracts in earlier solicitations. And over time, whereas, those projects were proposed in the Hudson Valley, 2-3 years ago now, the last solicitation last year, there were no large utility scale projects proposed in the Hudson Valley. And so that raises the question for me, whether or not, there are even any more sort of attractive or viable sites for such large projects left in the Hudson Valley. So it remains to be seen what the responses to this latest solicitation are. So For, other people, I don't, you can use the tool to sort of maybe do that kind of an evaluation in terms of whether or not large swaths of land that are available and next to a place where they can interconnect into the high voltage transmission lines exist. But I think for now, maybe Dan, you guys are the last Hudson Valley community to hit the jackpot in terms of having both that land and that interconnection. Along with, the folks who have some earlier proposed projects in Greene and Albany County.